The phone buzzed at exactly 10:47 on a Thursday night, and Darius Okafor knew before he read the screen that whatever came next would cost him something. 2 words from Celeste Harrington. No punctuation, no context, no softening. My office. He'd been sitting in the dark of his home office, the glow of his laptop, the only light reviewing the wreckage of 18 months of work. The Morrison merger had collapsed that morning with the specific violence of something that had been rotting from the inside for weeks. Creative accounting buried 3 layers deep in the target company's subsidiary filings. Darius had flagged the discrepancies 2 weeks prior, had written a clean 4-page memo, and sent it up the chain with the careful documented precision of a man who understood that in his position paper trails were armor. The senior team had pushed forward anyway, hungry for commission, certain the numbers would hold long enough to close. They hadn't. Now the question was, who absorbed the impact and late-night summons from the CEO of Sterling & Associates had never in Darius's 15 years of employment ended with congratulations. He sat for a moment with the phone face up on his desk. Through the hallway, the nightlight in Zoe's room cast a thin strip of yellow across the floor. Mrs. Garrett had texted at 8 to confirm everything was fine. Homework, finished dinner, eaten 30 minutes of approved screen time, the small domestic report that had anchored his evenings for 4 years. His daughter was asleep. The stuffed rabbit Naomi had given her was tucked against her side. The world outside this house was preparing to make a demand, and Darius took exactly 30 seconds to breathe before he stood, pulled his jacket from the back of his chair, and walked to the door. The drive downtown took 17 minutes through streets that belonged to the city's other shift, the people who stocked shelves and cleaned offices and moved through the world in the hours when everyone else pretended the world paused. Darius kept his hands easy on the wheel. He had learned a particular discipline over the past 4 years, the kind that came not from the absence of feeling, but from the practice of not letting feeling make decisions. Naomi had called it his stillness in the early days admiringly, and later when she was sick with something closer to worry. She had made him promise in one of their last real conversations that he wouldn't turn the stillness into armor, that he would remember the difference between calm and numb. He thought about that distinction now. He was calm. He was fairly certain he was calm. The tower rose dark against the downtown skyline except for the executive floor 42nd story, a single rectangle of light burning in the silence. His badge granted him after-hours access, a privilege that might expire before sunrise. The elevator was slow in the way that elevators become slow when a man is riding one toward something he cannot fully name. He counted floors. He thought about Zoe's face when she woke in the morning and padded into the kitchen expecting him to be there. He thought about the mortgage and the cardiologist appointment he'd scheduled for next month, and the specific financial mathematics of being a single father in a city that punished any interruption to income with compounding speed. By the time the doors opened on 42, Darius had organized himself into the shape of a man who had walked into difficult rooms before and walked back out. Celeste Harrington's corner office commanded the northeast corner of the floor glass on 2 sides. The city spread below like a circuit board someone had forgotten to turn off. The door stood open, light falling into the darkened hallway in a long parallelogram. She was behind her desk, still in the charcoal suit she'd worn to the board briefing that afternoon, but her hair had come loose from its severe twist, and she had not bothered to correct it. The financial press called her the Iron Queen, which she had never acknowledged publicly, and which Darius suspected she wore privately like a second skin. 4 years as CEO of the firm her father had founded. Not a single moment of visible uncertainty in all that time. Her hands were trembling. He registered it the way he registered most things about Celeste Harrington, quickly and without obvious reaction. She gestured to the chair across from her without looking up from the document on her desk. He sat. The silence stretched long enough for him to catalog small changes in the office since his last visit. A new print on the west wall, something with overlapping geometric shapes in muted ochre and gray. A crystal award from an industry association he didn't recognize. The scent of jasmine tea instead of the black coffee she usually drank at hours when she should have been sleeping. When she looked up, her eyes held something he had never seen there before, and it took him a moment to identify it because it was so entirely inconsistent with everything she had built herself to project. It was fear. She stood and crossed to the door and closed it, and the soft click of the latch settling into place felt in retrospect like the precise moment his life divided into before and after. "I'm pregnant." She delivered it the way she delivered quarterly projections, with flat clinical precision, as if the information were data, and the room were a boardroom, and he were one of 14 faces waiting to record it. 12 weeks. It's yours." The office didn't tilt exactly. What happened was more like a recalibration, the sudden awareness that the ground under the building had always been more provisional than he'd understood. Darius gripped the armrest of the chair and said nothing which was not calm and not numb, but something in between the specific silence of a mind running calculations it never anticipated having to run. 12 weeks. He counted backward without wanting to. 3 months. The anniversary gala at the end of the fiscal quarter, the one the board required attendance at, and that the senior staff endured with the resigned performance of people who understood that certain rituals existed to serve the institution rather than the individuals who composed it. Celeste returned to her desk and pulled a leather folder from the drawer and slid it across the surface toward him with the same efficient gesture she used in acquisition negotiations. She had consulted with legal. There were 3 options. Option 1, complete confidentiality. She handled it privately. His name appeared in no documentation. Option 2, a formal agreement, limited parental rights, financial obligations clearly delineated. Option 3, stop. It came out harder than he intended, harder than he'd meant for anything to come out in this room tonight. Celeste's eyes widened fractionally, the only indication that the interruption had broken through whatever executive frame she had built around this conversation. She was accustomed to people following her architecture, accepting the structure she created for difficult situations, and navigating within it. He had watched her do this with the board, with clients, with the senior team during the merger crisis. She built the room and people moved inside it. "You're presenting this like a financial instrument." He kept his voice level with effort. "Like it's a problem that can be managed with the right legal structure." "Because that's what it is." Her composure was assembling itself again, word by controlled word. "I didn't plan this. I have never wanted children. And I am not willing to allow a single night to compromise everything we've both spent years building." The thing that struck him sitting there in her office while the city hummed 42 stories below was not anger. It was a kind of exhausted recognition. He had spent 15 years in rooms where the people with institutional power decided unilaterally what the shape of his situation was, and he was required to respond to the shape they'd chosen rather than the shape that actually existed. This was a different version of the same architecture. He was being managed. "What are you going to do?" He asked it not because he was certain he had standing to ask, but because he was not going to sit in a chair and receive a presentation about his own life without asking. For the first time since he'd walked into the room, Celeste Sterling had no immediate answer. The uncertainty was brief, crossing her face and retreating before it could fully settle, but he saw it. "I don't know," she admitted. "That's why I needed to tell you first, before I make any decisions." He stood and moved to the window. 42 floors down the city continued its nocturnal business with complete indifference. He thought about Zoe asleep in her room with Naomi's rabbit pressed against her ribs. He thought about what this would mean for her, a father entangled publicly with his boss, the story writing itself in the specific, ugly shorthand that professional environments preferred the black analyst who'd traded his professional ethics for access to the CEO's favor. It didn't matter that the facts were more complicated. Facts rarely determined the story. The story determined itself. Naomi's voice arrived in his memory with the unexpected clarity it sometimes had in moments of genuine pressure. She had said near the end, when she understood that the timeline was contracting and she needed to say the things she'd been saving, "You're so afraid of making mistakes that you forget to actually live. Stop treating your life like an audit you have to pass." "I need time," Darius said. He did not turn from the window. "Of course." The professional mask had returned, audible in the 2 words' precise neutrality. My door is open when you're ready to discuss options." He left without another word, and the drive home was longer than the drive in. Every red light gave his mind another route into consequence. By the time he pulled into his driveway, the porch light was burning and Mrs. Garrett had left the living room lamp on in the way she always did when she knew he'd be coming home to an empty downstairs. He sat in the car for 2 minutes in the dark of the garage before going inside. Zoe was awake. She was curled on this couch with a book. Her reading glasses at the slight angle they always settled into when she'd been wearing them too long, and she looked up when the door opened with the alert expression of a child who had been waiting and had decided to pretend she hadn't been. 7 years old, with her mother's eyes and his stubbornness and a particular quality of attention that had always made him feel in the best moments and the hardest ones profoundly seen. "You're home late." Not an accusation, an observation. Meeting ran long. The lie came easily, which was its own indictment. She studied him over the top of the book. "You look weird." "Just tired." She returned to her reading in the way she did when she had decided not to push yet, and he moved to the kitchen and heated leftovers he had no appetite for, watching her through the pass-through window. The stillness in her posture had a particular quality that he recognized. She was thinking. He had been washing the same dish for 45 seconds when she appeared in the kitchen doorway. Book tucked under her arm, the expression she'd inherited from Naomi, fully deployed, the one that meant she had decided something and was now implementing it. "Dad, you can tell me if something's going on." She said it with the directness of a child who had learned through specific experience that adults withheld things under the false belief that not knowing was a form of protection. "I'm not little anymore." He looked at his daughter, this fierce, particular person who had survived more loss by age 7 than most adults accumulated across decades, and he felt the familiar compression in his chest that came with being her father, the awareness that she deserved better than evasion, and that he did not currently have anything better to offer. "It's work stuff." The partial truth landed like a full lie. Something moved through her expression that looked like disappointment, and she turned and walked back to the living room without another word, and the soft sound of her settling back into the couch was worse than anything Celeste Harrington had said to him that night. He stood alone in the kitchen with the water running over his hands and thought about what it cost to be the kind of father who told the truth about hard things and the specific price of being currently unable to pay it. The memory of the gala arrived later in the specific hours after midnight when Zoe was asleep and the house was silent, and Darius sat at his desk with Naomi's photograph in front of him. They had taken it on their honeymoon. She was laughing at something he'd said. Head tilted back, the particular laugh she had, that she was always slightly embarrassed about. Too loud for the setting, she always thought, though he had never thought so, not once. He was pretending to complain about the angle of the camera. They had been young, and they had been stupid in the specifically beautiful way of people who believe they have unlimited time. The gala had been 3 months ago. End-of-quarter mandatory attendance for senior staff, the kind of event that required a certain performance of professional enthusiasm that everyone present understood to be performance. He had stayed late finishing a presentation, the floor emptying around him, and then noticed past midnight that the light in Celeste Harrington's corner office was still on. He had knocked, expecting to find her reviewing documents. He did not expect to find her sitting on the floor behind her desk, with her back against the credenza mascara tracked in thin lines down her face and empty glass on the carpet beside her. She looked up when he appeared in the doorway, and he saw in the space of a single, unguarded second something that the Iron Queen had apparently been maintaining the Iron Queen specifically to conceal, something that recognized him. "My mother died this afternoon." Her voice had no iron in it at all. "I was in a meeting. I scheduled it because I thought I had more time." He should have offered condolences and withdrawn. That was the professional architecture of the moment, and he understood it completely. Instead, he found himself sitting down on the floor beside her back against the credenza because she was sitting on a floor alone in an office at midnight, and that was not something he could look at and walk away from. He told her about Naomi. Not the careful version he kept for professional contexts, the brief acknowledgement of widowhood that closed conversations before they could become complicated. He told her the real version, the 18 months of treatment and hope and recalibration, and the final weeks when hope became something different became a practice of presence rather than a reaching toward outcome. He told her about the guilt that never fully faded regardless of how many people assured him it wasn't earned. He told her that the phrase, "I thought I had more time," was one he had said to himself so many times in the year after Naomi died that it had lost all meaning, and then later recovered a different kind of meaning, something closer to instruction. She told him things about her mother that he suspected she had not told anyone else. The law degree abandoned for the sake of her father's company. The slow erasure of a person who had confused love with self-disappearance. The deathbed that Celeste had reached in time unlike today, and the way her mother had looked at her with an expression she still couldn't fully decode. One conversation became 2 drinks from the bottle in the credenza drawer, not extravagance but the kind of drinking that happens when 2 people need something to hold while they speak difficult words aloud. What happened after was not planned by either of them, and was not in the honest accounting entirely about the drinks. It was about 2 people sitting on a floor with their particular griefs and recognizing something in each other that they hadn't expected to find. In the morning, without explicit discussion, they had returned to their roles: CEO and senior analyst. The professional geography of their interaction had not changed. The night existed in a separate compartment filed under things that happened once and were acknowledged by not being acknowledged. Biology, as it turned out, did not file things in compartments. Friday arrived with the weight of things that cannot be delayed. Darius dropped Zoe at school, watching her disappear through the doors with her backpack that was slightly too large for her, the mild limp she got in her left leg when she was tired, the specific way she turned to wave at him before she entered the building, a habit she'd maintained since her first day of kindergarten, without either of them remarking on it. He had known about the mitral valve prolapse since her birth. A heart murmur the cardiologist had explained using the reassuring language of conditions that were monitored rather than immediately treated. For now it was manageable. For now she just needed to avoid overexertion. For now. 2 words that had lived in the back of his mind every day for 7 years, quiet most of the time, louder when she ran or climbed or pushed against the edges of what her body could sustain without consequence. He arrived at the Sterling & Associates building an hour early, as he had for most of his 15 years. Being first in and last out was a form of preemptive argument, a way of closing the gap between his performance and the assumptions some people brought to their reading of it. He had understood this strategy since his early 20s, and had implemented it with the consistency of someone who could not afford the cost of being underestimated, and had therefore simply decided not to be underestimatable. Celeste was already in her office. She was always in her office. Through the glass walls that separated the executive suite from the open floor, he could see her at her desk, phone to her ear, the particular posture of someone conducting business with the focused efficiency of a person who had decided the best response to an unstable situation was to make everything else as stable as possible. He sat at his desk and opened the financial model for the Techstone acquisition analysis that was due Wednesday. The numbers required his attention, and he gave them his attention with the deliberate completeness of someone who understood that competence was not merely a virtue, but a defensive structure. Around 10 movement in Celeste's office. Conrad Voss entered, followed by 2 members of the investment committee, the door closing behind them. Conrad Voss, COO for 12 years, who had been at this firm longer than Celeste had been running it, and who wore his resentment of that fact with the thin disguise of professional deference. He had made his position on Celeste's appointment audible at last quarter's board meeting, couched in the language of operational concerns, but the subtext had been legible to everyone in the room. The founder's daughter trading on a last name. Not a real operator. Not the right choice. He had looked at the board with the expression of a man who was certain history would vindicate him and was simply waiting for it to move faster. Through the glass wall, Darius watched Conrad talking. Celeste's expression was controlled and neutral in the way that required effort to maintain. Conrad gestured toward something on a document he'd brought. The 2 committee members listened. At the coffee machine, later standing behind the partition that divided the kitchen alcove from the open office floor, Darius heard 2 junior analysts talking with the casual volume of people who believed they were unobserved. Thompson's been getting all the premium assignments. Morrison merger Techstone the board consulting work. 3 times in Harrington's office in the past 2 weeks alone. Closed-door meetings. Must be nice to have that kind of access. He stood behind the partition and listened to the rest of it, and did not move until they had walked away. Then he set his coffee down on the counter with careful precision and stood for a moment looking at the wall. It had started. The story was already assembling itself from the available material, indifferent to accuracy, indifferent to the 15 years of documented performance that preceded it. The story required only pattern and implication and the specific readiness of an audience for certain narratives. He had understood since his first professional job at 23 that the narrative of a black man's success in predominantly white institutional spaces was always accompanied by a competing narrative that offered an alternative explanation for the success, one that required no acknowledgement of the competence that had actually produced it. He had spent 15 years working to make the alternative narrative untenable, and now the circumstances of a single night were handing it a foothold. In the afternoon, his phone buzzed with a text from a number he didn't recognize. When he opened it, Celeste's name appeared. A coffee shop 2 blocks south. 4 o'clock. Not office. She was in the back corner when he arrived. Laptop open, hair down, wearing jeans and a gray sweater, in a way that reminded him she was 41 years old, and a person, not just a professional title. She closed the laptop when he sat. "I've decided to keep the baby." She said it with the directness of someone who had made the decision alone and was presenting it rather than negotiating it. "I'm telling you as a courtesy before I inform HR and the board. Legal has prepared documents for either scenario. Full parental rights with shared custody arrangements or complete separation with financial support. Your name doesn't have to appear on the birth certificate if I'm not disappearing." He heard himself say it clearly without the hesitation he might have expected, given that the rational architecture of the situation offered several compelling arguments for silence. "Whatever you decide about legal arrangements or custody structures, I'm not pretending this didn't happen. I'm not letting you handle this alone because it's more convenient for everyone." Celeste looked at him as though he had switched languages. She was accustomed to people accepting the structure she offered, operating within the framework she constructed. He watched her recalibrate in real time. "Do you understand what you're saying if this becomes public?" "I know exactly what happens when it becomes public." He kept his voice low, even unhurried. "I've been calculating that particular risk my entire professional life. Every meeting, every presentation, every interaction filtered through the question of how it will be perceived. 15 years of being careful enough that no one could question whether I belonged in the room." He leaned slightly forward. "But I have a daughter at home who's going to grow up and ask me what kind of man I am. And I'm not going to be the kind of man who walks away because it was easier." Something shifted in Celeste's expression. Not softness exactly. A fracture in the surface there and gone. "You're either very brave or very stupid." "Probably both." A ghost of something crossed her face, too brief and too controlled to be called a smile before it was gone. She glanced at her phone on the table. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Conrad Voss just called an impromptu senior leadership meeting for tomorrow morning. He's been positioning himself for months." She gathered her laptop. "Be careful, Darius. Once this becomes public, you'll be the one who suffers most. They'll say you manipulated your way into my favor. They'll question everything, every promotion, every project, every success." He held her gaze. "I knew the risks when I told you I wouldn't walk away. That hasn't changed." She studied him for a moment with the expression she used on financial projections she wasn't certain she trusted. Then she nodded once and left. He sat alone at the reclaimed wood table and watched her disappear into the afternoon foot traffic and wondered if he'd just made the bravest decision of his adult life or the most expensive one, and whether those categories were in the end the same thing. Saturday morning, Zoe woke him at 7 with a gentle hand on his shoulder and a whispered, "Dad, I'm hungry," which was her version of having waited an hour already. He found her in the kitchen attempting to manage the milk jug, which was full enough to be unwieldy for someone her size. He took it from her without comment and poured while she held the bowl steady with the focused concentration she brought to tasks she had decided to master. Naomi had made elaborate weekend breakfasts, pancakes in animal shapes, French toast with fresh berries and powdered sugar, the kind of domestic ritual that required both skill and patience, and that Darius had never quite replicated. Most Saturday morning cereal was the goal. Achieving cereal without incident was victory. Zoe ate methodically, swinging her legs under the table. A piece of paper lay beside her bowl covered in the crayon drawings she'd been making all week. Variations on a figure he recognized but had not yet addressed directly. "What are you working on?" He poured coffee that was 3 parts exhaustion and 1 part caffeine and sat across from her. She held up the drawing without particular ceremony. The figure wore a dark suit with angular lines. Hair pulled back severely, and the mouth was a single horizontal stroke without curve in either direction. The eyes, however, had been colored in with careful attention, a specific shade of brown, achieved by layering 2 different crayons, and they were noticeably detailed compared to the rest of the face. "She has pretty brown eyes," Zoe observed, studying her own work with the critical distance of someone assessing a draft. "But she looks like she forgot how to smile, like you did after Mommy died." Darius set his coffee down carefully. "When did you see her?" "Last week when you forgot your phone. Mrs. Garrett drove me to bring it." Zoe tilted her head. She was in the big office with all the windows. She was looking out at the city, but her face was really still, like she wasn't actually looking at anything. He did not know what to do with the accuracy of that observation. He sat with it for a moment. "Does something about her make you want to draw her?" Zoe considered the question with the seriousness she brought to things that mattered. "Sometimes people get stuck being sad. You were stuck for a long time after Mommy. Then you learned how to smile again, but it took a while." She paused. "I think she's still stuck." The weight of what his daughter saw and understood settled over him with the particular heaviness of being known by someone who loved him without condition or agenda. "Did it bother you?" he asked. "When I was stuck, a little, but Mommy told me it would happen." She returned to her cereal. "Before she got really sick, she said you might be sad for a while and I should be patient because you loved me even when you couldn't show it right." He felt the specific ache of those words, the way they carried Naomi's voice inside them, careful and deliberate, planting what she knew he would need planted before she left. "Your mom was pretty smart." "The smartest." Zoe set her spoon down and looked at him with Naomi's eyes. "You should help the sad lady learn to smile again. You're good at that." He didn't answer immediately. The coffee in his cup had cooled. Through the kitchen window, the Saturday morning light was doing ordinary things to the backyard, making the grass look green and the fence look solid, and the world look like a place where the problems were manageable. "It's complicated," he said finally, and knew even as he said it that it was the beginning of an answer rather than an evasion. That somewhere underneath the complexity he already knew what Naomi's voice in his memory was going to keep telling him until he listened. His daughter picked up her crayon and returned to the drawing, adding small details to the corners of the figure's eyes, the kind of attention to a face that only made sense if you believed the face was worth knowing. And Darius watched her and thought about the difference between the life he'd built to survive and the life he might have if he stopped treating every risk as something to be minimized rather than carried. The phone on the counter showed no new messages. The city beyond the window moved through its Saturday at its own indifferent pace, and Darius Okafor sat in his kitchen with his daughter's drawing on the table between them, understanding that what happened next would depend entirely and without the possibility of delegation on what he decided he was willing to be. Monday arrived with the specific gravity of things that cannot be postponed. Darius dropped Zoe at school and watched her join the cluster of second graders near the playground entrance, backpack riding slightly too high on her shoulders, the half wave she gave him before turning away that was both dismissal and reassurance. He stood at the car for a moment longer than necessary, watching the space she had occupied after she'd moved through the door. The office was already buzzing with the particular Monday energy of people who had spent the weekend not thinking about work and were now performing the transition back with variable success. Darius settled at his desk and opened the Techstone analysis. Around him the floor moved at its ordinary rhythm. Across the glass partition, Conrad Voss arrived at 9:15 with the specific quality of a man who had spent the weekend planning something. What Darius did not know yet, what he could not have known, sitting at his desk with the financial model open on his screen and the coffee going cold beside his keyboard, was that the shape of the next weeks was already being arranged by people in rooms he wasn't in, with information he didn't yet have access to, toward an outcome that would require him to make the single most consequential choice of his professional life. He also did not know that the anonymous complaint had already been filed, or that the complaint had come from Conrad Voss's email account, or that this was only the beginning of what Conrad Voss had been building toward for much longer than anyone in the building had yet understood. The Monday light fell across his desk in its ordinary way. The city moved outside the window at its ordinary pace, and somewhere on the 42nd floor in a corner office with glass on two sides, Celeste Harrington sat at her desk with her hands steady and her face composed, and the knowledge of what she was carrying held close and private, waiting for the moment when the private became unavoidably public and everything she had spent 20 years building was asked to survive contact with the truth. Sylvia Crane arrived at Darius's desk at 9:15 on Monday morning with the unhurried precision of someone who had done this before and found it unremarkable. She was flanked by two lawyers he didn't recognize, both carrying identical leather portfolios, both wearing the expression of people paid to reveal nothing. The open-plan floor meant that everyone within 40 feet could see the approach, could read. The formation could draw the conclusion that the formation was designed to make unavoidable. Conversations dropped in volume without stopping. Keyboards paused. The specific quality of attention that offices develop for moments of institutional consequence settled over the floor like a change in air pressure. Darius closed the Techstone model, saved it, and stood. The conference room on the 38th floor had been chosen with the same deliberateness as everything else about the morning. Not the executive level, which would have implied he had standing there. Not the open floor, which would have been too visible. A middle floor, a neutral room, a table that suggested procedure rather than punishment while accomplishing the same thing. Sylvia settled into the chair at the head of the table with the practiced ease of institutional authority. The lawyers arranged their portfolios. The door clicked shut. The questions lasted 90 minutes. When had his private meetings with Miss Harrington begun? What was discussed in those meetings? Whether there had been personal contact outside of business hours, whether he had received project assignments that his position would not typically warrant, whether he understood the company's policies regarding workplace relationships and the appearance of impropriety. Each question was delivered with the same measured neutrality, the same careful absence of implication, which was itself the most precise form of implication available. Darius answered with the discipline of a man who had spent 15 years understanding that rooms like this one operated on the gap between what was said and what was meant, and that the only viable navigation was truthfulness deployed with precision. He confirmed the meetings. He described their professional content. He acknowledged the one conversation outside the office the coffee shop documented now in his own testimony and framed it accurately as a continuation of work matters. He did not lie. He also did not volunteer the specific information that Sylvia Crane's questions were circling without yet reaching directly. When she leaned back at the 90-minute mark with the expression of someone preparing to deliver a predetermined conclusion dressed as a procedural outcome, he already knew what was coming and had already decided how he would carry it. Mr. Okafor, we appreciate your cooperation. Given the ongoing review and the need to avoid any appearance of impropriety, we're placing you on paid administrative leave effective immediately. 2 weeks minimum, possibly longer depending on the review's findings. Not fired. That distinction would matter later, he told himself, though at the moment it felt like the difference between two kinds of damage that were both damage. He returned to his desk under the weight of the floor's collective awareness. He gathered his laptop. His external drive, the framed photo of Zoe he kept at the corner of his workspace, her gap-toothed smile from last year's school picture, the one where her reading glasses had gone slightly askew before the shutter clicked and she'd been too delighted with the joke to care. He moved with the same economy of motion he used for everything that required steadiness, and if his hands were not entirely steady, the controlled pace of his movements did not reveal it. Conrad Voss was standing near the glass partition of the executive suite when Darius passed, not blocking the path, not speaking, simply present with the particular posture of a man whose satisfaction was too complete to require expression. Darius did not slow down. He carried Zoe's photograph out of the building and into the October morning and sat in his car in the parking structure for 4 minutes before starting the engine. The house was different in the middle of a weekday. The quality of the light through the front windows was unfamiliar, falling at angles he associated with weekends, with sick days, with the specific disorientation of ordinary routines interrupted by extraordinary events. He set his bag down in the home office and sat at his desk and looked at the wall. The Techstone analysis was on his laptop. He could work from home. He still had access for now. The work was real regardless of the institutional context in which it had been assigned, and he had never been the kind of man who stopped doing the work because the structure around the work had been disrupted. He opened the model and stared at the numbers and understood within 60 seconds that the numbers were not going to hold his attention today. He thought instead about Conrad Voss standing at the glass partition, the specific quality of that satisfaction, the depth of it which suggested something that went further back than the past 3 weeks and reached further forward than the present situation. A man who had spent 12 years in the secondary position, watching the founder's daughter assume the primary role he believed was owed to him, would not be satisfied with merely forcing a temporary investigation. He would be building towards something. The phone buzzed mid-afternoon with a text from an unlisted number he recognized only because the message's precision identified it. Celeste, texting from the second phone she used for conversations she didn't want on her primary device. She had confirmed what Darius had suspected. The anonymous complaint filed with HR had originated from a company email account registered to Conrad Voss, but the larger information delivered in her characteristic absence of preamble was what reordered everything. Conrad had not been reacting to the situation between Darius and Celeste. He had been manufacturing a moment to use it. His kitten for the board had been drafted 6 weeks before the Morrison merger collapsed, before the merger's failure gave him a narrative to attach it to. He had been building the architecture of Celeste's removal for months and had been waiting for any available material to complete the structure. The merger's failure had been useful. The relationship between Celeste and Darius was more useful still. Darius sat with this for a long time. The house was quiet around him in the specific way that houses are quiet when children are at school, a quiet that contains the implication of return, the knowledge that the stillness is temporary. He thought about the mathematics of what Conrad was doing. The memo Darius had written flagging the merger discrepancies existed. His performance record existed. The audit trail of his project assignments, everyone merit-based and client-approved, existed. None of it would matter if Conrad controlled the narrative long enough to make the alternative story stick. He was still sitting with this when the school called at 2:15. The nurse's voice carried the specific calibration of someone trained to communicate urgency without escalating panic, and Darius was in the car before she had finished the sentence. Zoe had fainted during afternoon recess. She was conscious. Her lips had been blue. Her pulse when the school's medical aide reached her had been weak and irregular. The drive to Children's Memorial took 18 minutes. Every traffic light was a small violence. She was in the ER when he arrived, small against the white sheets monitors recording the activity of her heart, with the steady indifference of machines that do not understand what they're measuring. She managed a version of her usual expression when she saw him, the determination to signal that she was fine, even when the monitors disagreed. Dr. Reeves was a woman with the particular quality of directness that pediatric cardiologists develop, a manner calibrated to give parents the complete truth without the distance that would make it unbearable to receive. She pulled Darius into the hallway with the gentle efficiency of someone who had done this many times and knew that the conversation needed to happen away from the child being discussed. The mitral valve prolapse had progressed more quickly than the previous assessment had indicated. The episode that afternoon had been triggered by exertion, but the underlying deterioration was the real concern. Surgery, which had been characterized as a possible future consideration, was now a probable near-term necessity. The window was 6 to 12 months. The procedure had a high success rate. These were the facts presented cleanly, and Darius received them with the specific stillness that was not calm and was not numb, but was the practiced management of terror by a man who understood that his daughter needed him functional. He called Celeste without planning to. His hand found her contact in his phone, and the call connected before the deliberate part of his mind had fully weighed the decision. He told her the hospital name and the floor number. His voice sounded to his own ear like it was coming from slightly further away than usual. She arrived 40 minutes later, still in the suit she'd been wearing to whatever meeting he'd interrupted, moving through the hospital corridor with the directness of someone who had a destination and no interest in obstacles. She did not stop at the nurse's station to ask for direction. She walked to the room Darius had texted her and pushed the door open. Zoe's face changed when she saw her. Not with the performed brightness of a child performing recovery for a parent's benefit, but with something more unguarded, the particular relief of someone who had been hoping for a specific person and had begun to doubt they would come. Celeste sat in the chair beside the bed and took Zoe's hand, and Darius watched from near the door as the Iron Queen of Sterling and Associates asked Zoe what had happened in the specific way of someone who genuinely wanted to know. Zoe explained. The running during tag. The dizziness that arrived without warning, waking up surrounded by teachers looking at her with the expressions adults get when they're frightened and trying not to show it. Celeste listened with her full attention, and her full attention was a substantial thing. The same quality of focus she brought to acquisition negotiations turned now toward a 7-year-old's account of an ordinary afternoon that had become frightening. She asked quiet questions. She did not minimize. When Zoe grew tired, she closed her eyes without entirely letting go of Celeste's hand. That evening, after Mrs. Garrett had arrived to take Zoe home with strict instructions about rest and a follow-up appointment with Dr. Reeves, Darius and Celeste sat in the waiting area outside Zoe's room. The hospital moved around them with its own constant, unhurried urgency, the specific rhythm of a place that treated the extraordinary as routine because it had no other option. Celeste's hand found his without either of them addressing it directly. They sat in the contact without explaining it. Tell me about when Naomi died. Her voice was low, steady, carrying something careful inside it. If you can, he told her. Not the managed version, not the version designed to close conversations efficiently, but the version that actually happened. The 18 months of treatment and hope and adjustment and the specific cruelty of hope, the way it kept generating reasons to continue expecting things that were becoming less possible. The final weeks when the language changed and hope became something that didn't require an object. The morning he woke and understood from the quality of the silence in the house that the vigil was over. Celeste listened without looking away. When he stopped, she was quiet for a moment. Then she told him about her mother. Not the version she'd given him on the floor of her office 3 months ago, which had been the version of immediate grief, raw and unprocessed. This was the longer version, the one that had been living in her for 40 years. A woman who had been brilliant, specifically brilliant, who had folded that brilliance into the service of her husband's ambition until she couldn't recover the shape of her own. The law degree that existed as a framed document in a box in Celeste's storage unit. The woman who had looked at her daughter in her final weeks with an expression that Celeste had spent 2 decades trying to decode and had finally recently begun to understand. She was looking at me like a warning, Celeste said, like she was trying to tell me something she'd run out of time to say with words. The waiting area was quiet around them. Somewhere down the corridor, a child was laughing at something a nurse had said, and the sound was briefly, unexpectedly, the most ordinary and beautiful thing in the building. Needing someone isn't weakness. He said it without planning to the words arriving from the same place his words usually arrived from when they were true. Celeste looked at him with the expression she got when something surprised her, which was rare enough to be notable. I spent 2 years after Naomi treating every feeling like something to be managed, like grief was a project with milestones. Zoe is the one who taught me that needing people isn't the same as being broken by them. Celeste's grip on his hand tightened by a degree. She didn't speak for a long moment. When she did, her voice had lost its executive register completely, the one she maintained across every professional interaction with the consistency of long practice. What was left was something he recognized from the floor of her office 3 months ago, something that didn't have a title. I'm terrified of becoming her, of giving everything up and ending up with nothing. A pause. But I'm also terrified that fighting it has made me into something worse, someone who has everything and risks nothing. He turned to look at her fully. The hospital light was unforgiving, and she looked exhausted in a way that makeup could no longer conceal, and she looked underneath the exhaustion like a person who was done pretending the armor was comfortable. Her phone buzzed on the seat between them. She glanced at it, and her expression reorganized itself toward something harder. Conrad had sent a message to the full board. Emergency governance meeting scheduled for Friday at 2. The subject line described it as a leadership continuity discussion during CEO medical leave, not a proposal for temporary coverage. Permanent restructuring. He was moving faster than either of them had anticipated, and the reason he could move that fast was that he believed the board's tolerance for uncertainty had already reached its limit. The next morning, Darius was home again, the administrative leave converting his days into a kind of suspended time. The work still accessible on his laptop, but the institutional structure around the work having been temporarily dismantled. He answered emails from the external audit team that was reviewing his project history. He provided documentation. He sent the project approval chains, the client satisfaction records, the performance evaluations that had ranked him in the top 3% for 6 consecutive years. The evidence existed. The question was whether anyone with the authority to act on it was prepared to do so. He was making coffee on Thursday morning when Zoe appeared in the kitchen doorway in her school-clothes backpack on, studying him with the expression she used when she had decided to say something she'd been holding. "Are you fighting bad guys, Daddy?" He set the coffee pot down. "Trying to baby." She absorbed this. "Mommy said good guys always lose first, then they win." She pulled one strap of her backpack higher on her shoulder. "Are you going to lose first?" He crouched to her level the same way he had when she was smaller and the world was newer and the things she needed to understand were less complicated. "Maybe for a little while." She looked at him with Naomi's eyes for a long moment. Then she nodded once the way she did when she had accepted information and was filing it correctly and went to get her lunch from the counter. He dropped her at school and came home and sat in his car in the driveway for a moment before going inside, and then went inside and worked until the knock at the front door came at 2 in the afternoon. Conrad Voss on his porch had the specific quality of a man who had mapped the territory of a conversation in advance and arrived knowing every exit. He was wearing the casual confidence of someone who held all the leverage and wanted it understood that the leverage was being deployed as a kindness rather than a threat. Darius stepped back and let him in and did not offer him anything. Conrad settled into the armchair with the ease of someone at home in rooms that belong to other people. He laid it out directly, which Darius had to give him credit for. No pretense of social purpose. "You're a good analyst, Okafor, genuinely. You have a real future in this industry, just not at Sterling." He reached into his jacket and produced a single-page document folded in thirds. $850,000. Letter of recommendation to any firm you choose. Clean break. No dragging this through the press, no permanent damage to your record. Darius picked up the document and read it with the attention it deserved. The first page was the offer summary. The numbers and the terms all reasonable, all designed to look like a resolution rather than what they were. He turned to the second page. Standard non-disclosure language. Standard non-disparagement clauses. And in the third page, buried in the dense thicket of legal subordinate clauses in paragraph 7, the actual cost of the offer, complete and irrevocable relinquishment of all parental rights to any child or children resulting from his relationship with Celeste Harrington. He set the document back on the coffee table. "Think about Zoe." Conrad's tone shifted into something that might have been concern in a different man delivering it with a different history. "She needs a father with a career, not a father who got dragged through a scandal and came out the other side with nothing. The money secures her future, her medical expenses, her college, everything her mother would have wanted for her. One signature. Darius looked at Conrad Voss, this man who had sat in the secondary seat for 12 years, and assembled his resentment into a weapon, who had used the specific vulnerabilities of a 7-year-old child and a dead woman's wishes as negotiating instruments. He felt something move through him that was very clean and very certain. "My daughter deserves a father with integrity," he stood. "Get out of my house." Conrad remained seated for a moment, assessing whether this was a negotiating posture or a final position. Whatever he read in Darius's expression resolved the question. He picked up the document, refolded it, replaced it in his jacket. At the door he turned. "You're making a mistake. I've made plenty. Not a performance, not a construction, simply true. This isn't one of them." After the door closed, the house was very quiet. Darius stood in the living room for a long moment, aware of his own heartbeat, in the way you become aware of it when the body has processed something significant and is settling back into its ordinary rhythms. He thought about $850,000, which was a real number with real implications, which would cover Zoe's surgical costs with substantial margin, which would provide the kind of financial security he had been building toward for 15 years and could not guarantee from the current position. He thought about the weight of that number against the weight of who he was. His phone showed a missed call from Celeste. He called back. Her voice was flat in the way it got when she was exhausted past the point of performance. The board meeting was Friday. Conrad had the votes. Her lawyer was advising settlement, structured departure, severance, and benefits managed exit. The advice was professionally sound. She knew it was sound. She said this with the cadence of someone delivering information they had not yet decided whether to act on. Maybe Richard was right. The name she used for her internal voice when it told her things she didn't want to hear. Maybe stepping aside is the best thing for everyone. You can take his offer. I can accept the board's terms. We walk away before this gets worse. Something in his chest tightened, not with anger at her, but with the specific grief of watching someone choose the cage they'd always known over the door they'd just discovered. "You're choosing fear. Again." He said it without softening it, because softening it would have been the greater unkindness. Her voice sharpened. "That's not fair." "It's true." And then he said the thing he wished he hadn't. The thing that came from a place of his own fear, wearing the mask of honesty. "You're so terrified of becoming your mother that you've become something worse, someone who won't even try." The silence that followed was the kind that doesn't recover quickly. The call ended. He stood in the empty kitchen with the phone in his hand and the knowledge of what he'd said sitting in him like a stone. Zoe appeared from the hallway home from school, backpack still on. She had heard enough. Her expression was not angry. It was something quieter and more permanent. "Mommy said sometimes people need to fight to know they care, because easy things don't mean as much as hard things." She looked at him with the terrible clarity of a child who sees her parent failing at something important. "She said you were her hero. I believed her." She walked to her room. The door closed with the soft precision of something deliberate. Darius stood in the kitchen for a long time. At 11:48 that night, the phone rang from a number he didn't have saved. The voice on the other end was measured and clinical, and introduced itself as belonging to a physician at St. Catherine's Medical Center, and then the voice said that he was listed as the emergency contact for Celeste Harrington, and then the voice said the words preeclampsia and blood pressure and fetal distress, and the words came in a sequence that Darius's mind processed in the order of their severity rather than the order they were spoken. He was moving before the call ended, jacket in hand, keys already out. He stopped at Zoe's door. She was awake. She always knew. She was sitting up in the dark with the rabbit Naomi had given her held against her chest, and when he opened the door she looked at him with the expression of a child who has learned that nighttime phone calls mean something has shifted in the world. "Is it Celeste?" "She's at the hospital. She's going to be okay." He said it with the confidence of someone who needed it to be true. Zoe was quiet for a moment. Then she reached out and placed the rabbit in his hands. It was worn in the way of things that have been held through a long time of needing something to hold. Naomi had bought it when Zoe was 8 months old. It had survived 4 years of the specific love that children apply to objects, and it was softer in some places and thinner in others, and it smelled still faintly like the fabric softener Naomi had used. "Give this to Celeste." Zoe's voice was steady. "So she knows we're with her." He closed her into Mrs. Garrett's care 20 minutes later and drove toward St. Catherine's through the late city, the rabbit on the passenger seat beside him, and thought about what it meant to have a daughter who had more grace than he did, and whether, given everything, he deserved the inheritance of it. The answer arrived somewhere on the highway with the quality of things that are obvious once they stop being avoided. He was going to fight, not because the outcome was guaranteed, not because the risk was manageable, because his daughter had placed her most important object in his hands and told him to go, and because Naomi's voice in his memory was saying the same thing. It always said when he tried to make safety and dignity synonymous. They were not the same thing, had never been the same thing, and he had always known the difference. The hospital lights appeared ahead through the windshield. He kept driving toward them. The waiting room at St. Catherine's Medical Center was the kind of room that revealed people. Strip away the conference tables and the professional titles and the institutional furniture that gave everyone a role to perform, and what remained was what a person actually was when the structure fell away. Conrad Voss was standing near the elevator bank when Darius arrived, flanked by 2 board members whose names Darius knew and whose expressions carried the specific quality of men who had been summoned to witness something and were now uncertain about what they were witnessing. Conrad's eyes registered Darius's arrival with the brief recalculation of someone whose map of the situation had just acquired an unexpected feature. Family-only Okafor, delivered with the confident precision of a man who believed the institutional language still applied here in this room at this hour. A nurse appeared in the doorway that led to the patient corridor. She looked at Darius directly. "Mr. Okafor, Miss Harrington has been asking for you specifically." The silence that followed occupied the waiting room with a completeness that Conrad's composure could not fill. Darius walked past him without slowing, following the nurse through the door, feeling the weight of every set of eyes against his back, and not turning to address a single one of them. Celeste was in the 3rd room on the left. The monitors recorded her blood pressure with the steady urgency of machines that don't editorialize, and the numbers were still high enough to explain the IV line and the compression cuffs. Her face was swollen in the way preeclampsia produced, and she had been crying recently in the specific way of someone who had run out of the energy required to stop. When she saw him, something in her expression broke open in a way that had nothing to do with the Iron Queen or the CEO or any professional architecture. It was simpler. It was relief. "You came." Not quite a question, not quite a statement. The sound of an expectation she hadn't fully believed in finding itself confirmed. He crossed the room and took her hand, and her fingers were cold despite the warmth of the room, and he held them until the temperature began to change. "Of course I came." She spoke quickly with the compressed urgency of someone who had been alone with thoughts too large for the room. She was sorry for the call, sorry for hanging up, sorry for the things she had chosen before she understood what she was choosing. The baby was stable, still stable but complete. Bed rest was no longer optional, and Conrad was moving faster than either of them had anticipated, and she didn't know how to stop it from here, from this bed, from this particular helplessness. "Celeste." He said her name quietly, and she stopped. "You're not solving this tonight. Tonight you rest. That's the only job." Her face moved through several things at once. "I don't know how to do that." "I know." He pulled the chair close. "I'm going to stay. You're going to sleep. Tomorrow is a different problem." Zoe arrived 40 minutes later that same night, having overruled Mrs. Garrett with the specific determination of a child who understood that some situations required physical presence rather than telephone reassurance. She appeared in the doorway still in her pajamas, having apparently not considered this a detail worth addressing, and assessed the monitors and the IV line and Celeste's swollen face with the methodical attention of someone who had learned young that medical settings required accurate observation rather than performed distress. Then she climbed onto the chair beside the bed and took Celeste's free hand with both of hers, the contact immediate and uncomplicated. "You have to fight." Her voice carried the steadiness she used when she had thought something through completely. "The baby needs you. Dad needs you." A pause, the slight hesitation of someone adding something true that required vulnerability to say aloud. "And maybe I need you too, a little bit." What happened to Celeste's face in the seconds that followed could not have been produced by any professional skill she had developed across 4 decades. It was the specific dissolution of a person who has been holding themselves together against a pressure they were never going to sustain indefinitely, finding in the least expected source permission to stop. She pulled Zoe toward her with the careful awkwardness of someone managing IV lines and monitor leads, and she held her, and she cried the way she had not cried since the night her mother died, not with controlled precision, but with the full-body honesty of someone for whom the armor had finally completely been removed. Zoe held on without saying anything, without trying to fix or redirect or explain. She had learned from the specific experience of losing her own mother and watching her father grieve that some things needed to be felt rather than managed. She was 7 years old and already knew this with a certainty that most adults spent decades trying to find. Darius stood near the window and watched his daughter hold the woman he loved, and thought about Naomi, who had known this day was coming before he did, and who had raised Zoe to be ready for it without telling him that was what she was doing. Philippa Ashworth found him in the hallway 20 minutes later after Mrs. Garrett had taken Zoe home with a promise of return in the morning. Philippa was a board member in her early 60s who carried her authority the way people do when they've had it long enough to stop performing it. She had been at Sterling and Associates for 11 years, long enough to have watched Conrad Voss position himself, and long enough to have understood 2 weeks ago what she was actually looking at when the financial discrepancies stopped being explainable as error. She drew him further down the corridor and opened a leather folder without preamble. The numbers were organized into a clean structure. Expenses charted against account activity, vendor names against corporate registration records, the architecture of systematic theft made legible by someone who had stopped believing in coincidence. $1.8 million over 3 years. Ghost vendors. Falsified invoices. Audit deflection from accounts under Conrad's direct control. She had been working with the FBI for 2 weeks. The warrants were ready. "I need someone to stand up first tomorrow." Her voice was direct without pressure. The tone of a person making a request they understand is significant. "Conrad has the votes unless something changes the room before the vote happens. I can walk in with this folder, but I need someone to speak first. Someone who can remind 14 people what integrity looks like from the inside, not from a federal filing." She paused, and what came next carried a different weight than the rest. "I knew Naomi. She consulted for us on the Harrington strategic expansion 6 years ago, one of the clearest thinkers I've worked with." Another pause. "She told me her husband would change this company someday, not through spreadsheets, by refusing to be less than he is." Philippa closed the folder. "I believed her then. I'm asking you to prove her right tomorrow." Darius stood in the hospital corridor with the small, solid weight of Naomi's rabbit against his chest and felt the specific quality of a moment that would divide everything into before and after, and understood that the division was the point. That his life had been trying to make this division for years, and he had been preventing it in the name of safety. "What time should I be there?" He sat with Celeste until she slept, talking her through each scenario her mind kept generating with the patient repetition of someone who understood that anxiety didn't respond to being told to stop. He talked about Zoe and Grace and the specific kind of future that was possible if they stopped letting fear make the architectural decisions. He talked until her breathing slowed and her grip on his hand relaxed into sleep. He drove home past 2 in the morning and stood in Zoe's doorway for a long moment. She was asleep, the replacement rabbit against her side, her breathing even and deep. He did not wake her. He sat at his desk until 4, not preparing a speech, not building the logical architecture of a presentation, but simply sitting with what was true, what had been true for 15 years, that he had been willing to prove with numbers and documentation, but had never been willing to say plainly in a room where saying it had personal cost. He thought about the difference between defending yourself and simply being yourself in public without apology and letting that be enough. He went to bed at 4, and slept 3 hours. Friday morning, Zoe found him in front of the closet in the charcoal suit with the faint chalk stripe that Naomi had picked out 12 years ago on a Saturday morning when they were young enough to believe the right suit could make any room possible. Zoe stood in the doorway in her pajamas. "You look like a hero." "I feel like I'm about to throw up." She absorbed this without alarm. "Mommy said that's how you know you're doing something brave. Your body knows before your brain does." She crossed the room and held out Naomi's rabbit, which she had retrieved from his jacket and had apparently been considering overnight. "Mr. Patches protected me since Mommy left. Now he'll protect you." He tucked the rabbit into his interior jacket pocket against his chest. She hugged him with the full-body commitment she had always brought to the gesture. No reservation, no performance, just the complete physical fact of her love, and he held on for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, because his daughter had given him everything he needed, and he wanted to acknowledge that before he walked out the door. The Sterling & Associates boardroom on the 45th floor was designed to communicate scale. Floor-to-ceiling windows on the east wall, a mahogany table long enough to seat 30, portraits of the founding decade along the north wall, men in period suits looking out with the confidence of people who built things they expected to outlast them. At 2 in the afternoon, 14 board members occupied the table in their established configurations. Conrad had arrived early enough to claim the secondary head position, the seat that implied authority, without taking the chair reserved for the absent CEO. His presentation materials were loaded. He had the votes, and he knew it, and the meeting had, from his perspective, the quality of a conclusion seeking its formal announcement. Philippa Ashworth was already seated when Darius walked in. The room registered his entrance with the specific attention of 14 people whose professional training did not entirely conceal their surprise. He held no board position. He was a suspended employee, which made his presence technically a provocation and practically a statement. Conrad's voice carried the even precision of someone calibrating dismissal to avoid revealing concern. "This is a closed governance session, Okafor. You have no standing here." Philippa spoke before the room could settle around Conrad's framing. "I've asked him to address the board. The members can decide whether his remarks are relevant." 14 pairs of eyes moved between them and arrived without explicit vote at the conclusion that the question was not yet resolved. Conrad presented first. The slides were clean, and the data was real, and the narrative was constructed with the skill of someone who had spent 12 years learning how institutional stories were told and what made them stick. Medical leave creating leadership vacuum. Investigation findings no formal violation but documented reputational damage. Stock performance. Client confidence metrics. He did not use the word scandal. He used reputational uncertainty, which accomplished identical work with more professional deniability. When he finished Thomas Cartwright, the board chair looked toward Philippa. Philippa looked toward Darius. He stood. He reached into his jacket and placed the external audit report on the table, not the summary, the full document, and then he looked at the room. "My name is Darius Okafor. I have worked at this firm for 15 years, and I am the father of Celeste Harrington's child." The room became briefly more itself, the architecture of institutional decorum visible because something had pressed against it from the other side. "Every project I led over 15 years was assigned on merit. Every client result is in that report. My performance ranking was top 3% for 6 consecutive years, 3 of them before Celeste Harrington became CEO. The numbers aren't advocacy, they're arithmetic." He walked the perimeter of the table, making contact with each face in turn. "I have been told that this relationship makes my record look suspicious, that the access I had explains the success I had. I have heard that story my entire career applied to every achievement, every room I walked into. It is a useful story for people who need an explanation for competence that makes them uncomfortable." He stopped near the center of the table. "Judge Celeste Harrington by her work. 41% profit growth in 4 years. 3 Fortune 500 contracts that every analyst in this room called out of reach. A company rebuilt from the edge of a bankruptcy that the previous administration had spent years disguising as health. That is not compromised judgment. That is the best operational record this firm has produced in a generation, and you are proposing to discard it because the woman who built it made a human decision that inconvenienced the institutional narrative. He put his hand briefly against the small, solid weight in his jacket pocket. Not a performance. A private acknowledgement of where the courage was coming from. I have a daughter at home who is going to grow up and ask me what kind of man I was when the easy thing and the right thing were not the same thing. I refused to sell myself cheap so someone else could sleep easier. That is the only calculation that matters to me in this room today. Thomas Cartwright drew breath to respond. Philippa opened her folder. She distributed copies to each board member with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had planned this moment carefully. The room absorbed the materials in the particular silence of people encountering information that reorganizes everything they thought they understood. Vendor names that didn't survive registration searches. Account activity that moved in patterns that only made sense as concealment. 3 years of systematic architecture designed to be invisible. Conrad Voss has embezzled $1.8 million from this firm. Philippa's voice was the voice of someone reading a conclusion the evidence had already established. Ghost vendors falsified invoices, deliberate audit deflection from accounts under his direct control. The FBI has been investigating for 2 weeks. The warrants were issued this morning. The door at the far end of the room opened. 2 federal agents entered. The lead agent crossed to where Conrad sat and said his name and the charges and the words about remaining silent in the clear procedural voice of someone who had said them many times and understood their weight precisely because of how often they were said. Conrad stood. The room contained, for a suspended moment, the specific tableau of a man whose entire architecture of patience and positioning and accumulated resentment had just been reversed by the documents now sitting in front of 14 people who had been prepared 60 seconds ago to hand him what he had spent 12 years engineering. He looked at Darius. What was in his expression was not the satisfaction he had displayed at the office door during the administrative leave. It was something rawer, the look of a man confronting the specific cost of a plan built on the wrong foundation. "This isn't finished, Okafor." Tight controlled the last performance of a man being led toward a door he had not chosen. Darius looked at him steadily. "Yes, it is." The agents walked Conrad Voss out of the boardroom in handcuffs, through the door past the portraits of the founding decade and out of the building he had spent 12 years trying to own. The door closed with the sound that was in the room's silence more final than any formal vote. The board voted. 12 in favor, 2 abstentions. Full reinstatement, complete back pay, formal written apology. The anonymous complaint that had triggered the HR investigation was confirmed on the record to have originated from Conrad's email account. The investigation was closed. The source of the complaint was entered into the meeting's official minutes. Philippa walked him to the elevator. "She was right about you. Direct without sentimentality, which was its own form of tribute. Not because you won, because you didn't get smaller to get here." The doors closed and Darius rode down through a building he had worked in for 15 years and stepped out into the October afternoon and stood on the sidewalk with his hand against his chest where the rabbit sat in his pocket and allowed himself for the first time in a long time to simply be still without it costing him anything. 3 weeks after Celeste was discharged from St. Catherine's Grace, Naomi Okafor Harrington arrived. 36 weeks which the doctors characterized as early but not dangerous. The call came at 4 in the morning. Darius stopped at Zoe's door first. She was already awake, sitting up in the dark with the alertness of a child who had been listening for exactly this. He told her, and her face moved through a rapid sequence that landed on solemn joy, the expression of someone receiving news they have been waiting for and understanding that the waiting is over. She held out the rabbit. He shook his head gently. "Keep him tonight. She already has what she needs." The delivery lasted 8 hours, which Darius experienced as suspended time in which the ordinary world continued outside and inside the room. The only things that existed were Celeste and the work her body was doing, and his hand in hers through every part of it that required a hand to hold. At 1:34 in the afternoon, Grace arrived, 5 pounds 11 ounces indignant about the transition, announcing this indignation immediately and at volume. The nurses did their work and placed her in Celeste's arms. and Darius watched Celeste's face complete the transformation that Zoe's presence had begun weeks ago in a hospital room and that now finished itself without reservation. Every layer of professional distance, every careful construction of control that had been built and maintained across 4 decades of choosing capability over connection, it dissolved quietly and without drama in the presence of the small, specific person she was now holding. She's perfect. Barely above a whisper, the quality of someone saying something they can hardly believe is real. She's absolutely perfect. Darius touched his daughter's hand, this new daughter, and her fingers curled around his with the automatic reflex of the newly arrived. He felt something move through him that was not grief and not joy exactly, but the feeling of a life that had been carrying loss so long that wholeness felt unfamiliar, and was in its unfamiliarity more moving than he had known to expect. Naomi would have loved her. His voice carried the slight roughness of controlled emotion. Celeste looked up at him with eyes that had no performance left in them. She already does. Zoe arrived 2 hours later with Mrs. Garrett and a handmade card that read, "Welcome, baby sister," in careful printing, surrounded by a drawing of 4 stick figures of varying heights. She approached with the reverence of someone who understood that something significant was present. She studied Grace for a long moment with the scientific attention she brought to things that mattered. "She's really small." Celeste smiled. "You were smaller. 4 pounds when you arrived." Zoe's eyebrows rose. She reached out one finger, and Grace's hand found it with the same automatic curling grasp, and Zoe's expression became the expression of someone whose understanding of the world has just acquired a permanent new dimension. "She knows I'm her big sister." "She does." Celeste said it with the quiet certainty of someone stating a fact that has always been true. Zoe looked up from Grace to Celeste with the direct honesty she brought to the questions that mattered most. "Are you going to be my mom too? Like my real mom? Because you could be, if you wanted." The room held its breath. The monitors continued their steady work. Outside, the city moved at its ordinary pace, unaware of what was being decided in this particular quality of afternoon light. Celeste drew Zoe toward her, carefully managing the logistics of hospital bed and IV line and newborn, with the gentle awkwardness of someone learning the physical language of something they have never done before. "I could never replace your mom. She was extraordinary. She loved you in a way that doesn't run out." She held Zoe's gaze steadily. "But if you'll let me, I would be honored to be your mom on Earth, while she's your mom up there." Zoe considered this with the thoroughness she brought to significant decisions. Then she nodded once and settled against Celeste's side with the ease of a child who has made up her mind and is now simply inhabiting the conclusion. "Okay, but you have to keep doing the voices when you read to me. The monster voice is getting really good." Celeste laughed a real laugh, the kind that surprised even her, unguarded and warm and entirely unplanned. And Darius stood at the foot of the bed looking at his family, all of it, the new and the continuing and the absent presence of the woman whose love had built the foundation for all of this. And he understood that Naomi had not just left him a daughter. She had left him a direction. He had simply needed long enough to stop being afraid to follow it. 2 years passed with the ordinary speed of years that are fully inhabited. Zoe turned 9, and her heart remained stable in the way Dr. Reeves described at every checkup, with the same mixture of scientific caution and personal gratitude as one of those outcomes we can't fully explain but are simply glad for. Grace developed strong opinions about equitable distribution of her sister's stuffed animal collection by 18 months, a position she maintained regardless of what the existing ownership structure suggested. Celeste restructured the firm's executive layer after returning from leave, distributed operational authority, and built the kind of leadership model that the company had never had because its founder had never needed to consider what he was building beyond himself. Darius joined the board, the first black board member in the firm's 70-year history, and kept his senior analyst role alongside it because the work was real, and he had never confused institutional title with personal worth. They married in the spring, small and deliberate, in the presence of people who had witnessed the actual story. Zoe served as maid of honor with the grave dignity of someone who understood the role and had been preparing for it in her own way since she was 7 years old, and drawing a woman with no smile. Grace served as flower girl, and spent the majority of her ceremonial duties exploring the grass along the aisle and sampling several petals which the photographer documented with great enthusiasm and which became the image the family returned to most often in the years that followed. The adoption paperwork for Zoe was finalized 3 weeks after the wedding. In the courthouse hallway afterward, Zoe cried in the specific way she had classified as happy tears with the same matter-of-fact precision she brought to everything, and held on to Celeste until Darius put his arms around both of them, and the three of them stood in that ordinary hallway on an ordinary Tuesday, held together by paper and law, and the longer, harder work of having chosen each other continuously across 2 years of reasons that made choosing difficult. The autumn after Grace's 2nd birthday, the family visited Naomi's grave on the anniversary of her death. Zoe carried flowers from the garden, yellow and slightly unruly. Grace carried a piece of paper covered with the morning's crayon work, which Celeste had folded carefully into her pocket after Grace immediately attempted to eat it. Darius knelt and traced the letters of Naomi's name with 2 fingers, the gesture he had made every year since her death, the physical acknowledgement of a presence that had not stopped being present simply because it had changed form. "We brought someone to meet you." He spoke without self-consciousness to a person rather than a marker. "This is Celeste. She learned to stay when staying was hard. She reads bedtime stories with voices now. Zoe taught her." He paused, feeling the autumn light on his back and the grass cool under his knee. "And this is Grace. She has your middle name and your stubbornness and very clear ideas about fairness that I think you would recognize." Zoe crouched and set the flowers against the base of the stone. "Hi, Mommy." The ease of a child who had never accepted the premise that death required distance. "I have a new mom now, but you'll always be my first mom, the one who taught me to be brave." She glanced at Celeste. "Mama Celeste says thank you for giving her a family that already knew how to love." Grace had been occupied with the grass, but looked up at the sound of Zoe's voice and said something with great conviction that resolved into no recognizable word. Zoe translated without hesitation, with the absolute confidence of a big sister who had appointed herself her sibling's interpreter. "She says hello to Grandma Naomi." Celeste's hand found Darius's and he took it, and they stood in the late afternoon light of that October cemetery with their daughters around them and the city visible in the distance. The moment had no dramatic shape. It was not triumphant. It was something more ordinary and more durable. The feeling of a life that had been broken and healed into a shape that was not the original shape but was in its own configuration complete. Darius looked at the headstone at the name he had traced so many times that the letters had become a kind of language, and thought about everything Naomi had planted before she left the lessons in Zoe's voice, the faith in Philippa's memory, the permission that had traveled across 4 years to reach him exactly when he needed it. She had not left him directions. She had left him better than he was and trusted him to figure out the rest. He had. Not perfectly, not without cost, but honestly and without selling himself short, and in the end with his whole life. Rather than the managed version of it, he had been offering the world for 4 years. He stood and helped Grace up from the grass where she had settled with the contentedness of a toddler who finds all locations equally suitable, and the family walked back toward the car through the autumn afternoon, Zoe's hand in his, Grace carried against Celeste's side the cemetery quiet behind them. Some things don't end. They change shape and you learn to carry the new shape, and eventually the carrying becomes so natural that you forget it was ever anything other than simply living. Darius Okafor had spent 4 years learning that lesson. He had a family now that held every part of the learning, the grief and the fear and the courage and the love that had refused in the end to stay buried under any of it. That was enough. That was, he understood now, exactly enough.